Today we're going to be talking about something that's very serious that was implemented in Washington, D.C. in the early 1900s, very end of the late 1800s, like in the 1890s, that had a severe, long-lasting impact on the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan area. The ripple effect went on for decades after it was debunked by Howard University law professor Charles Hamilton Houston and Supreme Court Justice Edgerton and a lot of other NAACP lawyers. What we're talking about, this is something that when I say systemically was involved in the oppression and the division racially in Washington, D.C. I mean every word of it. Ran across a very great article. What got me started doing the research on this topic was I was reading, here we go. I was reading this book, Groundwork, and this is the life of Charles Hamilton Houston, the struggle for civil rights. Very, very, very great book. I encourage you all to, if you get your hands on it, keep that in your stash. It goes up to about 308 pages when you include the index. All right? Now, what I'm talking about is what's called racially restrictive covenants. And what racially restricted covenants were, these were bonding legalities that land developers and homeowners were putting in their deeds, saying that no Negro can buy this property, they cannot lease in this property, they can't sublease in this property, they cannot sell any segment of property, real estate, or land or home ownership anywhere in that process of buying, selling, renting, leasing, subleasing, all of that. The Negroes could not participate in, and they will embed that in the deeds. The owners and the builders, the land. So just imagine when you go through Washington, D.C. and you see all these skyscrapers and cranes and all, like, these are the land developers. They're building up the different areas. The land developers will put that inside of their contracts to who they're selling the land to. No Negroes can reside here, sell here, rent here, and all of that, right? This formed an exclusive racial makeup because it excluded African Americans, quote unquote Negroes, from acquiring real estate property. Now we say home ownership is one of the main ways to pass down wealth and acquire wealth. All right. So what happened is, all of these, the article I read was talking about the community called Bloomingdale in D.C. And what happened was all of the homes in that area, all of it, like, hundreds of thousands of homes, they all had that racially restricted covenants in their deeds and between the land developers. So basically you had swaths and square miles of land and real estate that black people could just not own, rent, sell. We were locked out. If you're familiar with DC, they said that from Florida Avenue on back, going towards Constitution Avenue, that's the only place blacks could really occupy. But from Florida Avenue up towards Silver Spring, blacks cannot occupy any of that because of racially restricted covenants, right? So I'm gonna go through some of this. I mean, this is a doozy. You're going to see, when I say systemic oppression, I'm going to really show you, when we say systemic oppression, systemic racism, you're going to see how that operates here. Now, the things is, these racial restrictive covenants, they were legally binding. Legally binding. And the DC Court of Appeals, there was a woman by the name of Clara Mays, who in 1944, she had property in a part of DC. She was renting with her family. She was renting. The homeowner decided that they were going to eventually sell the house and move somewhere else. So she had nowhere else to go. So she had went to try and purchase property in a racially restricted covenant part of town in DC, in Bloomingdale. And the white residents told her, look, you cannot purchase here, and we won't allow it. She and the NAACP had took her case to court, the DC Court of Appeals, and the DC Court of Appeals ruled that the racially restricted covenants were legally binding, and that she had no other means. She lost the case. They honored the DC Court of Appeals honored the racially restrictive covenants that were placed inside of these deeds and in the community. Right now. It said in some cases where deed covenants already serve that very purpose, by enforcing such restrictions, DC developers, private citizens, and courts helped lay the groundwork for zoning policies and real estate practices that promoted racial segregation. Right? In 1937, the DC Court of Appeals upheld restricted covenants as an effective, quote, barrier against the eastward movement of colored populations into the restricted area. Now, you also want to think about it like this. When they were really starting the racially restricted covenants in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this was because you had the mass migration of approximately 6 million African Americans from the South coming up north. Because remember, this is after Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction. So all African Americans are leaving the South and they're coming up north. And so many of the whites were like, they wanted to protect their land, they wanted to protect their territory. And so that's one of the main reasons why, that was their impetus on why they wanted to have these racially restricted covenants, right? It said on First Street, so this is in First Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., in the 1920s, white residents had signed agreements that their houses would not be occupied by or sold, conveyed, leased, rented, or given to Negroes for 21 years. Okay, so now they just locked in a time frame. Completely locked out for 21 years, all right? It said these agreements, combined with restricted covenants inserted in deeds by developers, meant that 6 consecutive blocks of First Street remained exclusively white in 1940 and served as a barrier to black settlement to the east, even during wartime housing crisis that strained the city's capacity. All right, they had 36 lawsuits against, the various homeowners and home associations that all were turned down and denied and ruled against by the DC Court of Appeals. So the DC Court of Appeals was for the restricted covenants, right? Now, I have to make sure that as I'm going through this, I can kind of flag you, just kind of ring the bell when I say certain things, because I want to make sure that you see how this is systemic, right? And then you think about gentrification now. I want you to listen to something that's key. They said, during the first half of the 20th century, the number of areas in which black people could live in D.C. shrank as new whites-only housing, playgrounds, and schools were developed. The growth of federal government and corresponding demand for new buildings and infrastructure added to the problems. Sounds very similar, but that was during the first half of the 20th century, right? Now, let's get into some interesting stuff here. Said, racial covenants were used in Washington long before they were known to have appeared elsewhere. So, this is DC was kind of like the origin of racially restricted covenants. They appeared here before they appeared anywhere else. But they became common during the first decade of the 20th century in the subdivisions that flourished during this period. Developers commonly adhered to industry and federal planning guidelines that promote the use of a variety of deed covenants. Covenants prohibiting the conveyance of property to African Americans and often to Jews or members of other groups were used in conjunction with covenants limiting construction to single-family homes. For example, a covenant forbidding the use of buildings as saloons or factories all served to protect residential property values, right? And I said, in concert with other methods of demarcating racial boundaries and commoditizing urban space, restrictive covenants assign value to housing and to the entire neighborhood according to the occupant's race. New subdivisions were marketed on this basis. In October of 1911, for example, the Washington Times ran an ad for Fairlawn in southeast DC listing, quote, "No Negroes" among its advantages. All right? Now, here's how it really financially impacted African Americans. The racial identity of home seekers effectively limited the supply of housing available to them, which drove up prices. The resulting scarcity meant that African American buyers often paid 30 to 40% more than white people paid for their houses. Okay, so what they're saying is, because of the fact that they had these racially restricted covenants and white people had so much of this territory locked down due to these racially restricted covenants, the amount of availability and accessibility to homes were scarce for African Americans. And so being that you have a scarce amount of something, it made the price go high. So African Americans were paying 30 to 40% higher than they really even should have been, just because you had this clause inside of these deeds by homeowners and land developers. So you see how this plays a part in everything, right? Now, this is something that we have to look at right here. It said the fledgling city planning movement found other means of enforcing segregation, with private developers and, time to flag it, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, an early promoter of racial covenants. So the National Association of Real Estate Boards was a promoter of racially restricted covenants, playing a central role in the developing of urban land use policy. Real estate leaders worked closely with professional planners at the Department of Commerce. Flag this. These real estate leaders worked closely with professional planners at the Department of Commerce to formulate federal zoning guidelines to protect residential neighborhoods from populations deemed incompatible with their intended occupants and thus likely to lower property values. All right? The Commerce Department also consulted with Northwestern University's influential Institute of Land Economics. All right? So the Commerce Department, is now consulting a research branch of Northwestern University. Right? So it's Northwestern University's Institute of Land Economics. And that institute drafted a model racial covenant and a code of ethics for the National Association of Real Estate Boards that included racial steering as a requirement for membership in the organization. Only members could use the trademark term realtor. As a result of this public-private partnership to segregate American cities, half of white-owned homes and virtually all new subdivisions were racially restricted by 1928, according to one estimate. The role of DC's local real estate industry in city planning during this period deserves further research. Okay? Now, here's the thing. It said the linkage of black occupancy with declining property values will become a self-fulfilling prophecy by the time the Federal Housing Administration institutionalized the use of racial covenants in the 1930s. All right, so we said the Federal Housing Administration institutionalized the use of racial covenants in the 1930s. And that was authored by a man by the name of Frederick Babcock. He was a real estate appraiser and an amateur economist, formerly with the Institute of Land Economics. That was from Northwestern University, right? The FHA's underwriting manual made the use of racial deed restrictions a criteria for insuring mortgages. So this man, Frederick Babcock, underwrote the FHA's criteria for insuring mortgages, and in order for you to have your mortgage insured, you had to have racially restricted covenants in there. And where did he get his teaching from? The Institute of Land Economics, from where? Northwestern University. All right. So I'm raising my hand, hoping that y'all are picking up on some of this, right? Now, here's the thing. We always hear about how we think about Rosewood. We think about what happened in Oklahoma, various cities throughout the country. Whenever there is a thing of black progress or blacks wanting to go ahead and get what they can afford, what they deserve, and what they want, there's always this violent white pushback. So in DC, this is what happened in November of 1923. In November 1923, more than 500 white Bloomingdale residents gathered at 1st and U Street for a march to the homes of 3 black families. None of these houses were subject to racial covenants, so instead the group issued an ultimatum, reporting the Evening Star, "You may not have known that you were buying property in a white neighborhood, but we expect you to vacate these premises. We will not sit quietly by while we have all of this threatened." Although the group promised to help find white buyers for the 3 houses so that the black families could sell their properties, at least 2 of the families refused to be intimidated and remained. White Bloomingdale residents' efforts to block African Americans from moving into their neighborhood gained support from the local real estate board. Okay, so hands up again. White Bloomingdale residents' efforts to block African Americans from moving into their neighborhood gained support from the local real estate board, which actively encouraged citizen associations to add racial covenants to deeds that didn't have them. So the local real estate boards is telling the Citizens Association, hey, if you don't have a racial restrictive covenant in your deed, you need to go ahead and add that. Okay? The Washington Real Estate Board's 1921 Code of Ethics advises members that no property in a white section should ever be sold, rented, advertised, or offered to colored people, and was cited as a model for the code adopted 3 years later by the NAREB, National Association of Real Estate Boards. So you have the Washington Real Estate Board doing its thing, right? Now, the Federation of Citizens Association promote the use of agreements to restrict housing. White neighborhood groups consequently circulated documents obliging both signers and future owners not to sell or rent to African Americans for up to 50 years. Okay, so now you just see how wealth is locked in and poverty is guaranteed. Why am I saying, or how am I figuring that out? The Federation of Citizens Association said we're encouraging and we're pushing all of our white neighbors to include these racially restricted covenants in their deeds for 50 years. I already told you from the earlier reading that what happened with these racially restrictive covenants, what did it do to home prices? Because there was a scarcity of homes, the price that blacks were paying for their homes were 30 to 40% inflated. So imagine 50 years of inflation. This is what locks in poverty. Meanwhile, whites in their area in DC, they're living good. They're living good. And they're able to buy houses at regular, fair, standard market price. Okay? Now, here's the thing. It said when the deeds, when the restrictive covenants were filed with the recorder of deeds, okay, listen, when they were filed with the recorder of deeds, the signed homeowner agreements became legally binding. So they would create these racial restrictive covenants, put them in their deeds, and then file them with the recorder of deeds, and that became legally binding. As a result of the Federation's campaign for covenants and the complementary effort of Washington Real Estate Board during the 1920s, race became a central means of defining neighborhood boundaries. By 1948, almost half of DC was racially restricted. So you see how this really crippled black wealth and crippled real estate for African Americans in DC. And then you have them putting this in there for 50-year coverages, right? Then it's like the courts enforce racial covenants. And what happened is you had it was a landmark case in 1926 called Corrigan versus Buckley. And that involved the 1700 block of S Street near DuPont Circle, where African Americans were trying to move in. And the DC Court of Appeals said, nope, we rule in favor of racially restricted covenants. Then what happened was, once the DC Court of Appeals said we're ruling in favor of racially restricted covenants, African Americans, their lawyers, decide they wanted to take it higher. We're going to take it to the Supreme Court, right? So we're going to take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then said, you know what, we're not going to hear these cases. All right? We're not going to hear these cases. This is what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court affirmed the legality of covenants implemented by neighborhood petitions. And we're not going to listen to what your case is. Corrigan versus Buckley stands. So either by declining to hear, meaning we're just not accepting the case, it's not going to make it on a court docket and it won't be argued in court, or the fact that they say, you know what, we support the DC Court of Appeals, Corrigan versus Buckley, the Supreme Court was in it. So now, when I tell you, and I hope you're listening, this is what systemic racism looks like, right? Because I told you that you had the Washington Real Estate Board that pushed the racially restrictive covenants. That was the Washington Real Estate Board. That is an entity. That is a system. You had Northwestern University Institute of Land Economics drafting model policy for racially restrictive covenants that they were giving to the people that ran the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority. So you had the Washington Real Estate Board, Northwestern University, you had the Supreme Court, you had the DC Court of Appeals, you had the Federal Housing Agency, you had the Federation of Citizens Associations, you had the Record of Deeds, the Recorder of Deeds, you had the National Association of Real Estate Board, and you had the Department of Commerce. You have 9 different agencies and institutions that are all complicit, all participating, all supporting, all condoning, and endorsing these racially restrictive covenants. That's what we talk about when we say systemic. That is systemic. One person, one family fighting against all that, you're not going to win. So when we talk about the wealth gap and we talk about reparations, these are just this is just one aspect out of a cogwheel of things, racially restrictive covenants, because that dealt with wealth and land and real estate and property ownership that we were denied and locked out of, that the government was complicit in. And like I said, systemic. Remember, I want to make sure that you remember exactly what I said. This was the Washington Real Estate Board, Northwestern University's Institute of Land Economics, the Supreme Court, the DC Court of Appeals, the Federal Housing Agency, the Federation of Citizens Association, the Recorder of Deeds, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and the Department of Commerce. That is systemic. And that's what we're talking about, that we're fighting against. And to this day, we're still dealing with systemic oppression. All right? So, lastly, I'll tie it up because I don't want to get any longer with this. You had Charles Hamilton Houston, who's from D.C. I believe his father was a medical doctor. I forget what his mother was. I believe he was Harvard trained. He worked in New York City closely. He was one of the head lawyers for the NAACP. And Charles Hamilton Houston became the dean of Howard University's law school. He was a teacher, he was a dean there, and he got some of his top-notch students and aides, and they drafted up probably one of the most landmark briefs to combat racially restrictive covenants. And they held mock trials and debates before they took their case to court. They had Howard University students and faculty observe and participate as lawyers, as jurors, and all of that. And they tackled it by saying, well, you're saying that you can't buy, sell, lease, rent to Negroes. Whites can't do that. They can't do this for Negroes. And so he said, well, what's a Negro? And what's white? Prove to me that you're white. Prove to me that I'm a Negro. And it was clever because they really couldn't prove it. He basically was saying there's no scientific evidence that you have to prove that I'm a Negro. These are social categories that you choose to designate that I don't subscribe to, we don't subscribe to, and there's no policy or scientific evidence to prove that. And that was how they started breaking it down. As they started piecing it apart, they knocked it down and won their case. And from there, they also partnered with 2 Italian land developers who were, you think about it like they're Italian, European immigrants, but the 2 Italians were working in real estate, and they were helping blacks get homes in these racially restricted territories. Kind of like, well, I have friends that are white, I'll funnel the deed through you, and then you get the property. You had the whites inside the community that were trying to sue those 2 Italian men and their real estate business because they were violating their restrictive covenant laws. And Charles Hamilton and Houston worked closely with these 2 Italian men. Their name was Urciolas. The last names were Urciolas, Urciolo. And they did a lot. Those 2 Italian men did a whole lot. They worked with Charles Hamilton and Houston in busting up these racially restricted covenants, and to the point that they actually started working at Howard University in law and real estate classes and taught real estate law and real estate. Forget the last. It was 2 things that they really taught in real estate for decades, and so they did a very big thing. So we take our hats off to them too. They didn't have to. So that's something that I just want to make sure that we knew and were cognizant of. And these things play a part in. And the other thing is this: racially restricted covenants happen all over America, especially in Minnesota. You've got to. There's a very good documentary. I wish I forget the name of it. But all over America, in New York, and parts of Long Island in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Philly, there's so many. When you go back and you comb through a lot of those deeds back in the 1920s, you'll see that they have racially restrictive covenants in there. So that's something that you want to look at and look up. And with that said, I just hope that you enjoyed yourself. I hope you enjoyed the education. And like I said, that is what we call systemic. And I'm not going to let you forget that. I'm going to remind you one more time what we were dealing with. When we say systemic, that's when you're working against the Washington Real Estate Board, Northwestern University, the Supreme Court, the D.C. Court of Appeals, the Federal Housing Agency, the Federation of Citizens Associations, the Recorder of Deeds, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and your very own Department of Commerce. That's what we mean systemic racism. Okay, this is not imaginary stuff. Oftentimes you hear people say, oh, you keep talking about this, the man, and this is exactly systemic racism.